Sounds
So
good, man.
all right, there we go. All right, so yeah, you're good.
Good to
Good to
go.
go. Perfect. Welcome back to this week's episode. I'm here in Zoom land with Brent. Well, actually, Brent, I'm going to stop there. How do you pronounce your last name?
Yeah, that's a good question, Justin. Thanks for having me. It's Brough, so it's a rough with a B. Most people
Brough.
say Brough, Brent Brough.
Okay,
Yeah.
Brough. Okay, so I'm not gonna publish that. I'm gonna restart because I realized I was gonna say bro, and then I was like, wait, it may not be that. So I'm gonna restart. It's Brough. Okay.
No,
All right, we'll start again. Welcome back to
no,
this week's episode. I'm here in Zoomland with Brent Brough, Chief Commercial Officer at InflowControl. Brent is an internationally experienced executive with a proven track record of building and leading teams within both private equity and venture-backed SME and a major ISC integrated services company. Brent, welcome to the show. How you doing today, man?
good, Justin. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're most welcome. And so for the listeners out there, I had a little boblet right out of the gate. Normally, I ask the question, "How do you pronounce a gentleman or a lady's last name?" before we start recording, and so I got to the point where I was about to pronounce his last name, and I was like, "Well, I should probably ask." So for everyone out there, yeah, it's Brough, and I was about to say bro, and so and I say that comically because most of the time people mispronounce my last name, and I can imagine throughout your entire life, people have somewhat mispronounced it. And so, yeah, it's always nice to at least, have the
Yeah.
respect to say, hey, how do you pronounce your name before you air it?
Much appreciated. Yeah, and I'd say 9 out of 10 people get it wrong anyway. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's all good. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, no worries, man. So, where are you visiting from today? I think that's a great place to start because it's not anywhere here in the US, that's for sure.
No, that's a good question. So I just landed back. So I live in Abu Dhabi in the UAE, or for those that don't know, United Arab Emirates. More people know about UAE from Dubai. Down the road, about an hour and 10 minutes is Abu Dhabi. Yeah, I landed in from Muscat, Oman. So I was there for a couple of days. We got an office out there and had some
Wow.
meetings with some customers and our internal team. And yeah, just a jet setter here.
Yeah, no kidding. So, if someone's never visited there, what would you recommend doing? Like if someone said, "Hey, I got to come on business for a week, like what should I do?" Like what would your playbook look like? Cuz I would imagine there's pretty cool stuff to check out.
Yeah, that's a wicked question. So I'm from northern Canada. So coming all the way to the Middle East, it's a huge shock. And most people when they hear going to the Middle East, you either have something that you've seen on CNN as,
Yeah.
as a certain view on how it is. I call it the CNN coefficient, which is typically flawed because it's super nice. The people are fantastic, safety is very high, but you can probably do almost anything. You think like Dubai, you can think about all the attractions that you want to do there. Abu Dhabi, you've got this Ferrari world, you got the dunes, they're hundreds of
Oh,
meters high. So you could go ride some dirt bikes, take some ATVs out there, do some dune bashing and some SUVs. So I think the sky is the limit. You could, speaking of the sky, you can do skydiving over near the Palm Jumeirah in Dubai.
oh,
So yeah,
dude,
pretty
that
exciting.
sounds amazing. It's yeah, because I've had so my one of my wife's really good friends, she's in the military and she lives in Kuwait. And so she's middle-aged single, so she travels and just like experiences everything. And following her Instagram, you'd think she's like an influencer, but she loves traveling and just like literally taking everything in that part of the world has to offer. And yeah, I'm just like, we need to go over there. Like it looks so cool. And then, like you said, like the sand dunes, and I would imagine like all the, like you said, like the ATVs, and just like there's so much to do. And so anyone who's ever gone to that part of the world always comes back with just the coolest stories. And the company I work for, we had some stuff happening overseas, and actually my boss went to Oman with a few other executives, and again, like just had such a great time, loved it, and had nothing but good things to say. And so for the listeners out there, if you do get an opportunity, whether to travel there or even work there, clearly Brent loves it. And so we're here to say we're not going to give you the CNN factor. We're here to tell you that it's actually really badass.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
but no, that's cool. And before we keep going, I do want to mention and remind all the listeners that I'm currently seeking sponsorships for the podcast. So if any energy focused companies are looking to increase brand marketing, visibility, and or awareness around your company's initiatives through the podcast, please reach out. I'd love to work with you. So Brent, either you aged very well or you started in the oil field when you were like 13 years old, but I couldn't help but notice that back in the 90s, you started your career And you mentioned in your home country, which is my home country, Alberta, Canada. Um, do you ever, when's the last time you went back to Canada? And let's kick off with your story.
Yeah, no, thanks. So, no, I started in the late 90s there. I went to Southern Alberta Institute of Technology before going on to York University, Lethbridge, and then MBA in the UK. But if I rewind back to your question, started in the field with a Canadian company called Frackmaster, and they were then acquired by Nausco and then BJ Services when they
Yeah.
actually made their way back into Canada. Yeah, thanks. A compliment. I don't know if my wife would agree that it's so nice.
Maybe it's the
I think.
Zoom filter, man. You got the Zoom
Yeah,
filter,
yeah.
just perfect.
Whatever it is, I'm going to save the settings on here for forever,
Yeah.
ever on.
Yeah.
But no, I grew up in northern Canada in a small town. And here's a trivia question for your listeners: if anyone knows where Flin Flon, Manitoba, is located. So
Uh,
yeah, it's a pretty remote city. You know, the state of Minnesota says the state of 10,000 lakes, and the province of Manitoba can brag it's a magnitude larger than 100,000 lakes. So beautiful
yeah.
place to grow up, isolated, more bears than there are people. But yeah, made
That,
my way to Calgary, went to school, and got into oil and gas because I needed money. And
right.
I wasn't really actually trying to get into oil and gas. I was actually pretty interested in alternative energy, and the Ballard fuel cell was there in the books at the time, and it was pretty exciting on what you could potentially do. So oil and gas was actually, as I grew up in a mining town, my grandpa, my dad worked around mines or diamond drilling for core samples for mines. So it was kind of, a working environment didn't upset me because I grew up around it. So
Yeah.
started working in the field. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think it's again, it's funny. I went to SAIT as well, and it was after a few years on the rigs, but I can always identify and really respect those who kind of cut their teeth in the field working for small little service companies or whatever the case was. But before you got into going to school and getting into the oil field, I mean, growing up in Flin Flon, what does a guy do in Flin Flon growing up? I mean, a bunch of pond hockey and fights or what?
Yeah, pretty much. There's a joke that I probably won't say on air. There's two things that come out of Flin Flon, and one of them's hockey players. So, no, it
Okay.
was an amazing place to grow up, to be honest. I think because as a kid you had all this freedom, and then you had the ability to just go out in the bush. 2 blocks away, you're in the forest. So I look at it now. My kids here in Abu Dhabi with us don't have that same kind of freedom. It's just a different setup for how you can get out.
Hmm.
But yeah, there's a lot of ice hockey, famous ice hockey players there. Bobby Clark, who led the Philly Flyers for a long time. Reggie Leach, you got Ken Bumgartner that came out of there. So there's some famous
Yeah.
hockey players made it to the big show in the NHL.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
really neat. It's always fun to have an individual from Canada on the show. It's like, we could kind of dive down some old history and just chop it up about the good old days back in Canada. But for the listeners out there who are like, yeah, that's just the attic above a cool house party, we understand. Okay, just relax. But no, so I'm gonna kind of pivot here. And talk, energy, and then we'll tie into your journey as well. And this may lead into it, but overall, I mean, what core belief have you changed your mind on over the last few years? And I mean, related to energy and has there, because I mean, obviously right now we're going through a major shift, a lot of policy initiatives. A lot of companies are really embracing the ESG initiatives that really investors are looking for. And then just overall, like the initiatives to say, hey, like we understand climate is a serious part of like decision making, how we conduct business. But does anything sort of, growing up, because back in the day it was, for a long time with drill baby drill and climate was discussed, but over the last few years, has anything kind of shifted your mindset to where then you're kind of leading a little bit differently, or do you still have kind of the same philosophy around energy in general as you always had?
Yeah, good question, and it's a bit pretty expansive answer. When I look at it, so growing up in a mining town was a supremely energy intensive environment there. You could see how much energy in Manitoba and Canada, the northern, the attic and the party, so to speak, was really blessed with hydropower. In studying engineering and then going abroad, and I did my master's in Warwick University in the UK on global energy, and we got a very good perspective and some depth in different energy sources, such as the largest wind farm in Europe at the time was outside Glasgow. We got to visit that. We got to visit district heating. We got to go to China to see at the time the most advanced supercritical coal-fired power plant. So what that gave you was a different perspective on energy sources on top of the hydro. And you look at it, everyone in the energy industry is talking about transition, but what was lacking, and maybe answer the question, is a plan, right? A transition, that's great, and it sells a lot of Instagrams and TikTok videos, but it takes some pretty difficult engineering to make a plan on how the societies around the world are going to actually secure energy. And energy is not just oil and gas. It's you know, you need to heat the home. You want to cook your food for your kids. You want to drive your vehicle to X, Y, or Z, pick them up from soccer or baseball practice. So I think for me, I'm probably more disappointed. There's so much news and press on this transition, and we need to make a change. And I fully agree. What's lacking is substance and context on how to make that transition. You know, you take all the blackouts that are happening around the world the last couple of years, you can see there was a mismatch on policy versus the practical element to actually do. So oil and gas, it's a key part, but not just for the energy consumption. But I think in the oil and gas side is we can do so much more to reduce the emissions per barrel of oil produced. You know, like drill, baby, drill. You want to frack a lot of the wells. You have to think, okay, why are we producing, you know, 9 barrels of water for 1 barrel of oil? That's a bit insane. So we have to look at how can we improve, and I think you need to start measuring inches everywhere, and it'll all add up to a lot of ground covered. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and that's, I mean, I was taking notes because these are just such great talking points. And I think you're right. It's and politics is funny, right? Like for me growing up in Canada, my family, you know, politics were not really discussed in our household, you know, not for any particular reason. We're just, my parents had their own business and it was all like family business and that's all that mattered. And the reason I say that is, you know, energy policy now is something that like I live and breathe, just because it ultimately is going to impact my career, the decisions I make about my career moving forward. But it's, you know, hope is like, I don't know if you know who David Ramsden Wood is, but he always touts hope is not a plan, right? And it's just like, you know, and so you talk about plan, and I say that comically, but it's true because there's a lot of, and I think there's a lot of like a lot of challenges around, here's the North Star, but it's like, how do we actually get there? And when you look at it from like a, you know, political perspective, there's a lot of hype, and hype gets what, you know, votes, clicks, whatever the case is, but you build this narrative and it's like, everyone's like, yes, this is awesome. But it's like, okay, how do we actually do this? And so where I really appreciate sort of that engineering mindset is like, these are all great, but it's like, let's put pen to paper and see how we can actually like put this plan into action, and how do we get there? How do we go from not just go from A to Z? It's like, oh yeah, 2050 net zero. Okay, how? Like, and I would imagine there's companies out there who have certain plans and milestones and things of that nature. But I think, you know, that your sort of exposure to where you grew up and then going, like you said, to York and doing the global sort of energy management stuff, similar to myself, when I did mine here in the US, it was like, wow, this all ties together, and it's there's so much we can do on all verticals of energy to make, you know, to help achieve these goals. And you know, and I think, you know, who you work for, which we're going to talk about, I think you guys are up to some really neat stuff that from a oil and gas perspective can really help achieve and be part of the plan to achieving these goals that a lot of folks have set out to do. And so you know, kind of tying into the question, or to supplement the question I just had, is what do you think the biggest challenge or what is the biggest challenge you feel that exists within the entire energy landscape? And I think you kind of touched on it, but in terms of like maybe like getting a little bit more granular in terms of like whether it be technology, whether it be, you know, investment. I mean, where do you see the biggest hurdle that we're going to have to overcome here, let's say over the next decade, to kind of get to these lofty goals that we've set out?
Yeah, and some people agree with what I'll say and some won't, but I think the discipline and conviction to follow through on plans with clear runways for companies to make that massive capital investments. Because without that clear runway, and you talk about the politics, removing the politics would clarify things, because companies and their shareholders and stakeholders could look longer term, deploy the capital that takes a long time to get a return on investment. Because you look, this is what is the key impediment, is an ability to put capital to work with the greater good in mind. And I think there's some amazing companies and amazing people trying to make huge changes in the world. But if you take like the energy grid and all the blackouts, California is an easy one to talk about. And a shout out to you, said David Ramsden-Wood. I follow him for a long time, and I don't know him at all. I find it exceptionally entertaining and enlightening because it's all figures, right? He
Yeah.
quants everything. And so you go through it, it's like, okay, I don't know if everything he writes is correct or not, but I can't validate that, but I enjoy there's a methodology behind a defense of a situation on the data. And it all comes down to the data. What do we know? What don't we know? But when you look at take the blackouts in the power system and all the grid, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars that need to be invested, and it'll take a really long time to get a return on that money. So where's that money coming from, right? Are we taxing it from people? Are people willing to start to pay more for this to make the transition faster? And no one has these honest discussions, and like you said, pen to paper on what that means for an impact. Most people are trying to, just put food on the table and save up for summer vacation, or buy their kids some Christmas presents, or Ramadan presents over here. Wherever you are in the world, you're trying to just enrich your life for your family. And so most of it does fall on the wrong sound point. Yeah. But
Yeah.
on the energy industry, we need it from multiple sources. And your question would be varied because it's different in the US than it is in Latin America, than it is in Saudi Arabia, than it is in the UAE, than it is in Europe. They all have different challenges, but it comes
Great
down
point.
to a longer term plan. Yeah.
Huh. So I guess, Kenna, where you're from, I mean, you're in a very different part of the world than here. And Inflow is clearly a global centric company, but I mean, just out of genuine curiosity, like where you sit there in your part of the world, like how would you, I guess, describe the difference in, say, challenges from, say, the US versus where you're at? Because I think, again, just for satisfaction of my curiosity,
Yeah,
I wouldn't know.
sure. So if we look back, a bit of a history, and if we go back 4 decades, 2/3 of the world's oil and gas companies now rebranded as energy companies because they're doing more than just hydrocarbons. Were international oil companies and not the NOCs or national oil companies. But that shift in transition has occurred over the last decade, if not a little longer, into 2/3 is controlled by NOCs, which are national oil companies like Saudi Aramco, ADNOC here in the UAE, PDO in Oman, KOC in Kuwait, just to name some large ones. And what that does is it changes when they have a perspective as a country and as a society where they're looking decades ahead. It changes from Q1 to Q2, Q3 focus. When you're stuck in the cycle on a publicly traded company, you've got to appease the shareholders, you've got to appease the analysts, and you're always looking at EPS or earnings per share. So your focus on some of the investments might not fit into the KPI set by a board, or the KPI set by your manager, or the KPI set by your unit president. It all differs. So the challenges on where the capital is going to be deployed depends on where you are in the world, because when you have the ability, take nuclear, when you have the ability to look 30 years ahead, that okay, we have a population, we're going to grow at X%, and we need consistent and stable electricity. Well, that changes the way you can look at a nuclear power plant. Whereas other parts of the world, you might say, well, nuclear is bad, we're going to go to wind and solar, and then you have a different discussion. So it's
Yeah.
a tough question to generalize. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really an interesting answer. I haven't had someone sort of, kind of have that sort of lens, but it's extremely valid. And I think you're right. It's depending where you are in the world, that those challenges, some have already, come and gone, and some are real as we speak. And so, no, I appreciate that. And so, pivoting to more towards what you are involved with on a day to day, tell
Yep.
us about InflowControl and how your company's slowly fitting into the future of energy.
Yeah, no, thanks. So yeah, the company I work for, hand on heart, we're trying to change the oil industry, and we are proud to say we're in this industry. We're trying to recover oil with less associated emissions, and that's through downhole technology. So the company is a Norwegian company, which is quite environmentally friendly relative around the world. A lot of hydropower they're blessed with from nature, but also if you look back at the history, Statoil, now Equinor, the large pseudo state-owned oil company. That is probably one of the best companies to recover maximized amount of hydrocarbon recovery from their fields, and that's by applying engineering, technology, discipline, and how they're producing the fields. So the three founders for InflowControl, they all had a career at Statoil before it was branded Equinor, And so they founded this company, InflowControl, and they were part of the reservoir research. So the three founders of the company, said we can make a difference and we can make a change. And so they left, pretty safe jobs at a big oil company in Norway to take a big risk and start InflowControl in 2011. And yeah, it's been obviously the journey has been long. I've been here about 4 years, and yeah, we're now 54 people around the world, and we're making a big difference. So our technology allows the oil and gas companies to install. We've got an AICV, or autonomous inflow control valve, and what it does essentially is it by mechanical forces viscosity and density. When gas or water break into a wellbore, it will automatically, based on the differences, the viscosity and densities from the oil to the water or the gas, the valves will stay open for oil. And as you get more water, it starts to become more and more restrictive as that water cut increases without any intervention. So you don't need to get any wire line into the wellbore. You don't need any coil to go shift, slick line. So it does it automatically. So you save on the manpower capital. We also save on the time, and we're stretched for resources in the industry. So having people to do less on the wells and keep them more stable and on board producing more net oil, it's a critical factor because we're in such a human labor shortage right now. Yeah.
Huh. So essentially for the folks who aren't familiar maybe with downhole or reservoir, like, so when you go and drill a well, oftentimes you'll produce not only oil wells are not just oil wells. They can, like you said, you can have water, you can have gas, a little bit of every between. So essentially it's a real time, it adjusts sort of real time depending on what kind of flow you're having into the well. So you can adjust your production real time. Is that by like pneumatic, or is that by like sensors, or how is it doing that?
Yeah, it's a pretty elegant technology that was developed and took years and millions to do. So it's based on the fluid properties. So it's fundamental physics. So as I tell my kid, there's no Harry Potter involved in this when I show him the technology. So it's based on viscosity and density differences. So the oil has a different viscosity behavior than the water. We have a pretty good YouTube channel on InflowControl.no, and it's on there. Goes through the animation, but for any folks that are not on the reservoir side, we'll install these autonomous valves across the reservoir. So much like if we talk about the US and you run in the frac sleeves, we wouldn't frac through these valves. This would be after you'd be finished a stimulation, after you finish drilling the well and finding the hydrocarbons. And you're right, 9 to 10 times more water is produced than oil. This is a crazy fact, right? And it's not Dasani drinking water or Perrier. This is water that you got to pump the surface, which costs a lot of electricity. You got to treat it, and you got to dispose of it. Those are three macro costs for any company to have to deal with. So if you can leave a lot more of the water in the reservoir, you keep the reservoir with better pressure, but you also save a lot of costs. So that's what we're after, is to try to increase the net oil recovery by applying the technology.
Right. So if a well, can you ultimately extend, I guess, does it help with decline curves and everything and anything like that? Again, I'm a drilling guy, so I may be asking dumb questions, but like, can you maybe explain that part of it, or is it more like, let's just say a well has, or sorry, go ahead.
No, it's a perfect question. So it depends, right? To be honest, like to look at it from an engineering perspective, we look at every reservoir on its own, because we will make the valves for that reservoir, because every reservoir has different oil properties, different water properties, different gas. So if it's a carbonate or a sandstone formation, as all reservoirs are different. They'll all have similarities, but we take each case and we look at it, and then we determine, is it a good case or not? And so roughly a third of the cases, we actually advise our clients, we'd like to make revenue, but our integrity and trust is more important. If we can't help our customer make better wells, then we tell them we can't, or advise on a different solution. That's typically not from us, but 2/3, if not 70% of the wells around the world, we can tackle pretty easily. And then we'll apply, dependent on the reservoir properties with the team, our subsurface engineering team will review and come up with some scenarios based on iterative work with the oil companies. And then we'll come up with some reviews. And so on your question, can it arrest the decline? Yeah, it dramatically can improve the oil recovery. So the decline is one thing, but if you can extend the recovery factor, because when wells start to water out, most of the operators, what do? Shut them in. And that's a stranded asset. So if you're talking to a CFO, that's a lot of finance tied up in that well that's not producing any cash.
Right. And then too, I mean, if you look at it from uh uh if you look at it from, again, like, an ESG perspective, if you're not having to deal with that associated water, associated gas, because there's a lot of energy inputs dealing with that, whether it's haul off, whether it's building infrastructure to be able to handle it, pipelines, everything else. If you can keep
Yeah.
everything, in the ground and only get what you need, that, to me, looking at it very binary, it's like that makes a lot of sense. You know what I mean?
But, and you're right. And I think the oil and gas industry, and for those that are in the industry will kind of chuckle, we are not innovative. We like to talk we are, but we are not. We are one of the slowest technology adoption companies when things go downhole. It's a big shift to go to digital now, and it's fantastic where we can save time. But the core root of the business is in the reservoir. The money is not made anywhere else. If you don't have a good reservoir to produce the hydrocarbons in oil and gas, you don't have that great of a business. So the reservoir quality and how we treat the reservoir is the most important way to look at improving cash flow. But also back to your question on emission reduction, there was a publication done with one of the Shell secondees working in Oman, and it's published data now, so I can reference the SPE to you later. But one of the byproducts that was not the reasoning for buying our AICV technology was the emission reduction, because they had to have such large pumps. And so for those that aren't in the production side of the space, after you drill a well, some of these wells might not have enough pressure to lift the fluids, so you add artificial lift or pumps. And so in this case, the pumps were so big because they were producing so much unnecessary water that they could downsize the pumps dramatically because we were producing less water, but we increased the net oil. They got a 60% emission reduction because of downsizing the pump. Yeah, and it's pretty straightforward, right? If you have to produce less water, you have a smaller pump, less electricity bill, right? Pretty straightforward. But you can quantify these benefits. And again, it's all about looking at the reservoir, how to tackle it, does it make sense? And if it does, you can have huge. The payback typically on these projects, 3 weeks to 12 weeks. So that's pretty exciting for companies, right? Where else can you get that kind of return on
That's
capital?
a small, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, that's a small injection of capital for the ROI there. It seems like a no-brainer. So, I mean, again, and I ask this because a lot of times, I talk to folks who, like yourself, and this to me could be a great game changer, which it obviously is. I mean, what's the downside? Like, where's the limiters? What's the challenges? I mean, I would imagine there's been some bumps and bruises along the way, and you don't have to get in the details, but I guess for Inflow, what is your guys' biggest limiter right now? I mean, people, is it technology? Is it, customer adoption? I mean, what are you kind of seeing right now?
No, and I'll probably give a few points. So, like any company, if the companies are honest, they'll get the whole story. Every new technology company goes through this hurdle phase of learning on what worked, what doesn't. And most of that happened before I joined. As a company is founded in 2011. I was only here for 4 years now. So a lot of that iteration on the R&D phase and the development went through the teething phase. So our first well was run with Saudi Aramco summer August 2015, still producing good. But there's no public data on this. We haven't been able to publish a paper yet, but it's been through the process and was approved with Aramco, and they're one of the largest users in the world of flow control equipment. So we're quite proud of that, but it's very tough. So the investment was high, the iterations on the technology development and what they, as one of our many customers, would like to see goes through. But I think the valve, what it can do, it does great. But for example, you can't frack through it. So if you wanted to run in, say in the US, and you wanted to frack a well, you would have to have this with a frack sleeve or this with an injection sub to stimulate. So it doesn't do everything in that manner, but it's not there to do everything. And when everyone says it can do it all, it usually doesn't do anything great. So we do something great. Focus on what you can do and focus on the purpose. And we focus on managing the reservoir, which is where all the cash comes from. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's kind of,
No, it's a great answer. And I appreciate the transparency there. So are most of the wells that you've deployed this technology conventional reservoirs then, or are they verticals, horizontals, or kind of a
yeah.
mixed bag then?
Most of our wells to date have been horizontal. We can do verticals, no problem. We've done some of these in Latin America with different reservoir layers. So
Cool.
for those not familiar with the reservoir pressures or the reservoir behaviors, if you look at a well, sometimes there's different reservoirs in the same well bore. So you'll drill a well and you might have different layers. When you have dramatically different pressures downhole, you'll get cross flow. And what that means is one layer will produce into another, or one layer will dominate the whole production from another. So you might have a lower pressure section of that reservoir that is, laden with oil, but you might not be able to produce it because the well won't allow you to. So by
Right.
putting this technology in there, it'll balance out the pressures and allow you to produce from all of the zones. So that's one application in the vertical cases. We're pretty excited. We just did our first carbonate well in the U.S. land, and so one super exciting point that we're looking at as a company is, the U.S. was one of the biggest oil and gas producers in the world years ago, before the frac, before all this multi-stage frac boom came back, horizontal wells came in, and there's all these reservoirs that are still, blessed with a ton of oil left in them. But
Yeah.
why hadn't it been produced? They didn't have the technology, Justin. So
Right.
one aspect we're looking at is all of these brown fields that are sitting there shut in that are 95, 98, 99% water, but there's still a lot of oil saturation in the ground. That's a massive opportunity. Much lower
See,
capital,
yeah.
and easy to access. Yeah. But you have to scan them to make sure it's a good candidate. Yeah.
For sure, but no, you bring up just an amazing point, and so I don't know if you know who John and Richard Spears are from Spears and Associates out of
Yeah.
Oklahoma.
I
So they have
follow
a
their
pot.
podcast.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the most recent one is they were talking about like our oil companies essentially like drilling themselves out of business, and because they had mentioned, and for the I mean you've maybe have listened to it, but for the listeners I encourage you, regardless if you're oil and gas or not, they bring a lot of light into what's happening across the market on the oil and gas side. But they mentioned what new technology is going to ultimately change the game. Arguably frac technology completely changed the game in oil and gas. It allowed the US to just dominate from a production standpoint. Arguably, people drilled themselves out of jobs and all to, and aside from the economics piece to the shale revolution, arguably it was like the biggest game changer in the energy industry, in my opinion. But something like reservoir control and using technology to really maximize recoverable, I think is the next revolution, because there's so many wells. And you mentioned be able to produce from multiple formations, and oftentimes that can lead to challenges because you can produce from one and into the other, whatever. But I look at West Texas again, the Permian Basin. Everyone knows the Permian Basin, and there's so many. I mean, they've been drilling and producing for years and years and years. There's probably 10 different formations, all within 10,000 feet of vertical section. It's like, to me that just makes like a lot of sense. It's like there's a lot of wells that are probably P&A'd or maybe just aren't producing that well. But to me that just, again, not necessarily like, well, how can we drill better? It's like, well, how can we produce better? And so I guess a question and thought that I had sort of as you're talking is like, from a macro perspective, if you were to look at a reservoir, hypothetically, if you deployed all of this downhole, could you use machine learning and AI and like all this buzzword stuff, whatever, but like, can you essentially use technology to like manipulate like an entire reservoir to like really maximize its potential?
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions, and so I agree with the premise of what you just said there. Full stop. And yeah, the Spears, I like listening to their podcast, and it's a great discussion because it comes back to the earlier points. Who's rewarded for doing a longer term investment? And if you go back to the frac, all the ducks that were there, the drilled and uncompleted wells in the U.S. There was a flurry of cash that came in from the venture cap world and the investing, and they were trying to get a very fast return on investment for fracking these wells. So they were drilling these wells, maybe not completing them at the time in terms of stimulation and flowing them back. But there was a different premise of where the money was deployed, and it
Mm,
wasn't thinking long term. And that's
right.
a key point. And you got to think. So what you're talking about is the reservoir management, and a lot of companies do think longer term on how they're going to manage the reservoir very well. So from a reservoir management, if you think about this like a bank or like an investment, longer than 4 quarters, and it's back to how a company looks at the cash flow, because they might be more interested in having a fast payback and then figure it out next year, or they might have a plan on just doing plug it off and then produce. There's different strategies. So there's a lot of technology. Ours is one of many. We think we have a great technology, but there's many different technologies that you could apply to help a company. So on the data learning, yeah, if you can get the information on these reservoirs and you can start to filter through the good candidates, you then have a much sharper target on where you can deploy your limited capital. So if you want to go in and deploy technology like ours, we do all of this screening with the operators for free, because it's really important to build up the trust that we're not trying to sell services on this. We want to know, can we help them or not? And that's how we actually pick better wells and better candidates for the customers. And you know, Mother Nature's difficult. The reservoir is not always there, and in the models that our customers work on are, you know, a lot of them are based on assumptions or old data or no data. So this industry is still a challenge, but I think you're right. You can get the data and advance it with machine learning for sure.
Yeah, no, I like the term the reservoir management. It's not, and maybe that's a term that gets thrown around in the subsurface world, but to me, that's just you know, is, you know, likely the future of oil and gas to exist. It's really you know, it's capitalizing on reservoir management, and it sounds like, you know, hopefully you guys are looking, and it sounds like you're looking around the corner to capture the upside of that, because ultimately land is finite, right? I mean, you can only drill so many wells because you're going to run out of inventory or space, or, you know, whatever the case is. And so I just think that's absolutely fascinating. So we were talking earlier, you know, you and, or sorry, some of the folks within Inflow here are here in Houston this week. And for the listeners, we're recording this on October 5th, which is ATCE week here in Houston. Why don't you talk a little bit about your guys' presence here? And I know you guys are doing a presentation and a paper. And so do you mind speaking a little bit on that?
Yeah, for sure. So we're doing a publication. Our colleague coming up from Bogota, Alberto, is going to be doing the presentation, and so we're pretty excited. We've got some of the customers coming up to visit as well. And in there, it's about how to manage the decline of the oil production with an ingress of water. So typically, a lot of the reservoirs, you know, they'll have a very fast slope, which is, you know, of the oil production, like you were talking about earlier. How do we arrest that decline? And this paper that we're presenting, you know, is going to be able to publish that findings in terms of how we can arrest it and flatline it, where we can start producing more of the oil so we recover more. So yeah, ATCE, we're really excited. Post-COVID, everyone's back to normal-ish, and we're going
Right.
to shake some hands and hopefully have some coffee or beers with the customers. So our CEO and co-founder, Dr. Vidar Mathisen, is in Houston right now. We've got a live demo at our booth at ATC, and why we have invested in making live demos is so, you know, you could come by, our suppliers, customers, potential customers can come and see how the valve works. It's based on physics, and so we're going to have the same thing at ADIPEC out in Abu Dhabi in another 3 weeks' time here. So it's one of the largest energy conferences in the world, and we'll have a big set of demos where customers can come up and say, okay, how does it work? We'll say,
Yeah.
we'll show you in front of your eyes. We've got a mini reservoir tank that shows how the valves work. We've got you know, an example of gas breakthrough showing how the valve shuts like that in front of your eyes. So yeah,
Yeah.
we're pretty excited. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And we had a call a couple of weeks ago, and I was sharing my passion behind content and getting out there and shouting from the megaphone to make sure everyone knows about it. But being that everyone's here in Houston and you've got the you know, the show and tell there, is that something that's also for those who weren't at ATCE who are interested? You said you have a YouTube channel. Is like the similar demonstration also on YouTube? Is that right?
Yeah,
Or
we're putting our content on there. So on the YouTube, we've done a big investment with a lot of the videos are with our CEO, co-founder. So Vidar and Bjornar and Håvard are our three founders of the company, all based in our headquarters in Norway. We've done a lot of engineering science-based videos on YouTube. So it can be applied for anyone who's interested. And
sweet.
it applies to other companies' technology. So you can go in and learn. For us, is open book transparency better, because
Yeah.
when everyone understands more, you make better decisions. So yeah,
Yeah.
go on the YouTube channel for InflowControl, and we do have the animations. The video demonstrations haven't been uploaded there, but that's a good idea to
Yeah.
have that put it on that. Yeah.
Yeah, on at ADOPEC, I encourage someone in marketing or whoever to have their video or their camera, their phone out and taking videos and uploading them to LinkedIn, maybe do a LinkedIn live. You know, that's you got to get out there. I'm going to keep pushing on you.
Awesome. So
Yeah.
so so we'll get on it. I'll take your advice.
I know you got a lot of fish to fry, and getting on YouTube and TikTok's probably not a primary objective, but I promise you the ROI is there. Just bear with me.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a live debate right now within our company, and especially as we got younger and younger engineers coming in, which is great to see people still coming into this industry because
Yeah.
from a science and discipline depth, right? Like the amount of, you get to talk about chemistry, you get to talk about engineering, mechanical, corrosion, the whole gambit. If you're a techie nerd, you can cover everything in this industry, right? So I
Yeah.
think it was painted with a pretty bad brush, but I think there's some pretty exciting careers for young engineers coming out of
No,
school.
it is. And we talked, I don't know if we mentioned this when we talked initially there, but we had some interns come in to the company that I work with. And, I'm always interested on like, I say this 'cause I feel like I'm a kid still, but like, what are the kids into nowadays? And so I went to each intern. I was like, hey, look, I said, if you were running like marketing, or if you were looking at information to try and find out information, whether on the company or what we do, is where would you go? And most of them said probably TikTok or YouTube. And like
Yeah.
none of them said, oh, I'm going to go to a conference. And so I was like, well, what's your biggest advice? They're like, if companies would get on like these platforms, like younger engineers would probably like buy into what they're doing way more than anything else. And it would like, I just was blown away because I always thought that, but to hear it from interns, I was like, this is hilarious. And so I like told everyone that I know, I'm like, you need to get on TikTok because all the interns are loving TikTok. You gotta get on.
so
So
so I had this question with my daughter, the same thing, and she's like, you don't need to go on there." And I think she just didn't think I was cool
yeah,
enough.
right. Dad, stay in your lane, please. Facebook, that's
Yeah.
all you need. Right. So the last question I'll have to kind of close things out is, talking about inflow control. I mean, clearly you guys have some fascinating technology. But I would imagine the finish line is not anywhere's in the near future. What does the future look like for inflow control? I mean, what's the vision that's been painted for the company? And I mean, where do you guys want to be in 10 years from now? I mean, has that been thought of or discussed or?
Yeah, I think in like every time always have to have a North Star, and for us is helping our customers make better wells. And it sounds a bit fluffy, but it's true because if we help them, if they're getting a return on that well and the entire cost within 3 weeks, that's amazing. You feel good, right? You feel
Yeah.
good, and the customers are excited. They come back and buy more technology. Everyone enjoys it, but it's a lot of tough work to get there. So we think we can change this energy industry in terms of the oil and gas market, because right now we only focus on oil reservoirs, and we're really targeting the old wells that are shut in. It's tens of thousands of wells. Like, man, this is an absolute huge opportunity for the whole industry. The money is less to get into it. It's tough. You need to do a lot of engineering, especially when it's $95 oil. Because you look, I can drill a new well, get the money back. But the gas market, we're working on a gas AICV that's going to shut off water from gas reservoirs. So the bigger
Ah,
transition, of course, is more energy is coming from the gas reservoirs where it's located. But remember, a reservoir, the gas is not just dry gas like your barbecue. It's not like you turn on a well after you drill it. It's
yeah.
riddled with problems, right? And a lot of gas reservoirs are plagued with water challenges. So we're
Hmm.
working on that right now with quite a few operators, and to work on the development plan. We've had a prototype for a few years. So for us, that transition is how can we help these energy companies deplete their reservoirs for a faster ROI? And
Yeah.
yeah, that's what gets us up in the morning.
Man, that's huge. And I've the utmost confidence that you guys are going to achieve that. And so this has been a crazy conversation. And again, I love it. And hopefully the listeners found it, informative, and hopefully they'll click and look at some content that you guys are doing YouTube, learn a little bit. But so before we close out, I do want to ask on a personal question, but not too invasive. You're busy, you're traveling, chief commercial officer, which I'm sure you've got your hands in all sorts of things internally, externally. But do you have any daily habits or routines that contribute to the success to keep you say that's what gets you up in the morning, but ultimately you can't pour from an empty cup. But like, what do you do to keep that cup full, to have that energy to just keep grinding and going and moving forward?
Yeah. So, I've got 3 kids, lovely, lovely wife, and I couldn't do any of this without my wife supporting all of this, right?
Wow.
I know when I started my MBA living in Norway, I used to work for one of the biggest service companies when I was living there. And, she supported everything, got to travel around the world for work. And so she's our glue. She's the CEO of the family, right? holds
Yeah.
it together. So I think the spending the time with the kids, that for me, trying to give them a better life, and same as my parents did growing up in Flin Flon, Manitoba.
Nice.
But when it comes down to work, we got some amazing people to work with, and that helps keep the inspiration and fire. And I'm pretty driven personally, so I want to see that we're successful. And then working with our customers when they get excited about the technology and what it's doing, what it could do. It's all that loop together that keeps it going. And for burning off stress, I like to socialize. I've learned to golf here, but I play ice hockey, and so for
Yeah.
the northern Americans up in the northern states will understand and respect that. So we actually here in Abu Dhabi we have an ice hockey league. So playing the rec
No
league,
way.
yeah. So we play, usually once, twice a week, and it's fantastic.
Good for you, man. That's huge. I'm a huge proponent of, just health and fitness, and if executives or anyone for that matter wants to perform at the highest level possible, you got to take care of your body. That means, mind, body, spirit, everything else. And just being physically active, being strong, not only mentally but physically, I just think gives you that competitive edge. And when everyone's kind of, petering out at 3:30, 4 o'clock, you're full of piss and vinegar getting after it. And so that's what separates the good from the best. You know what I mean? And so I can certainly appreciate that. And you mentioned, the support at home. When folks ask, similar questions to me, it's like, oh, you got so much going on. How do you do it? You're always positive, this and that. I said, it all starts at home. I mean, with the support and the kids, a loving home, this, and then beyond that, it's everything else is easy. If my wife's happy and the kids are happy and they're able to pursue their dreams and goals, it's easy for me to wake up and get after it, because that's what it's all about, right?
Amen. I fully agree. Fully
Yeah,
agree.
right on. So what's the best way for people to reach out to you or to hear more about Inflow?
Yeah, so the YouTube channel has a wealth of data, information videos if people are interested and don't want to talk to anyone, and that's why we put it there. So it's InflowControl, InflowControl, and the website is inflowcontrol.no, or Norwegian company. So that's
Yeah.
the URL. And my details are on there. I'm on LinkedIn, Brent Brough, as you said.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd love to reach out to people, even they're just curious, or new engineers coming into this space, or people thinking about making an energy shift. I try to take the time to actually give some feedback or pointers. I've been blessed to be able to move around to 4 different countries around the world from Canada. So got to move to Russia, the UK, the Norway, and then here in the UAE. So
Wow.
yeah, reach out LinkedIn or a website and find my details.
Perfect. Well, I'll put all the links in the show notes. That way it's easy for people to click through. And yeah, again, thanks for coming on the show. And for the listeners out there, really appreciate it. Please share, send this episode to someone who you think might find it informative. And always remember that everyone deserves access to energy, and we is greater than me. Thanks, everybody.